There's a moment in every archaeologist's career when they realise they've been digging in the wrong place their entire life. Not the wrong coordinates, not the wrong continent, but the wrong reality altogether. Tonight, I want you to experience that moment without leaving your bed. You've heard of Atlantis. Everyone has. The lost city beneath the waves. The advanced civilization with crystal technology. The tragic victims of a natural disaster 10,000 years ago. Except here's the thing that will keep you awake long after this story ends. Every single detail you think you know about Atlantis comes from one source, one man, one conversation, one afternoon in ancient Athens when a philosopher looked around at his crumbling democracy and decided to tell the most elaborate lie in human history. But here's what will really disturb your sleep: it worked. For over 2,000 years, that lie has been more powerful than any truth. It has launched 1,000 expeditions, inspired countless books, and convinced brilliant minds to waste their lives searching the ocean floor for something that never existed. The most famous lost city in the world was never lost because it was never found. It was never found because it was never built. Before you get too comfortable, before you dismiss this as just another debunking, let me ask you something. What if the greatest archaeological discovery isn't about finding what's buried, but understanding why we buried it? What if the most important truth about Atlantis isn't that it's fictional, but that we desperately need it to be real? Take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Because tonight, we're not just exploring a lost city, we're exploring the lost corners of human nature itself. The places where truth and fiction blur together so completely that the distinction becomes meaningless. So dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're about to discover that sometimes the most powerful truths are the ones that were never meant to be true at all. You're sitting in a library that smells of aged parchment and olive oil from the lamps that flicker against the Mediterranean darkness. The year is somewhere around 350 BCE, though you wouldn't measure time that way. Outside, Athens sleeps fitfully, a city struggling with its own identity after the chaos of recent wars and the execution of Socrates. The scroll before you bears the title Timaeus, written in careful Greek letters that seem to dance in the lamplight. Your fingers trace the opening lines, and you feel that familiar tension that comes with encountering something that shouldn't quite make sense. Here is Plato, the philosopher who taught his students to question everything, who insisted that the physical world was merely shadows on a cave wall, telling a story so rich in concrete detail that it reads like a historical account. You can almost taste the salt air as he describes an island larger than Libya and Asia combined, positioned beyond the Pillars of Hercules where the Mediterranean gives way to the endless Atlantic. The story unfolds through the voice of Critias, who claims he heard it from his grandfather, who heard it from Dropidas, who heard it from the great lawmaker Solon himself. Solon, the story goes, learned of this ancient war from Egyptian priests at Sais, keepers of record stretching back thousands upon thousands of years. It's a chain of transmission so carefully constructed that you find yourself wanting to believe it, even as your rational mind whispers warnings about stories that come wrapped in such elaborate credentials. According to Critias, the Egyptian priest told Solon about a time 9,000 years before his own, when Athens was not the Athens of his day, but something greater, more disciplined, more pure. This ancient Athens had faced an enemy unlike any other naval empire that controlled lands from the Atlantic Ocean to the very borders of Egypt. And Italy, the priest called this empire Atlantis after its first king, Atlas, son of the sea god Poseidon. You pause in your reading, listening to the night sounds of Athens drifting through the window. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks, and you hear the soft murmur of voices from a late symposium. The mundane sounds make the words on the scroll seem even more otherworldly. You're reading about a civilization that supposedly flourished when Athens was young, led by kings who were literally the children of gods. The story draws you deeper. Poseidon, it seems, had fallen in love with a mortal woman named Clito, who lived on a hill at the centre of what would become Atlantis. To protect her and their children, the sea god carved the hill into alternating rings of land and water, creating a natural fortress of extraordinary beauty. 3 rings of water and 2 of land, each perfectly circular, each connected by bridges and tunnels that allowed ships to sail right to the heart of the island. You find yourself imagining the engineering marvel this would have been. The outer ring of water served as a harbour where ships from across the known world could dock. The middle ring contained barracks for the island's formidable navy, training grounds, and workshops where craftsmen forged weapons and tools from the island's abundant metals. The inner ring, closest to the central hill, was reserved for the most sacred buildings, temples clad in silver and gold, royal palaces whose walls gleamed with an unknown metal called orichalcum. At the very centre stood the Temple of Poseidon himself, a building so magnificent that every surface was covered in silver except for the pinnacles, which blazed with gold. Inside, a colossal statue of the sea god dominated the space, so tall that his head nearly touched the ceiling. Around the base of the statue, golden figures of dolphins seemed to swim through a sea of precious metal, frozen in eternal play. But it's not just the grandeur that captures your attention as you read. Plato has filled his account with details so specific, so practical, that they feel like the observations of someone who had actually walked these streets. He describes the intricate system of underground springs that provided hot and cold water throughout the city. He maps out the precise dimensions of the Great Central Plain, 450 miles long and 300 miles wide, protected by mountains that sheltered it from northern winds. He even explains the social structure of this vanished world. The Atlantean society was organised much like the ideal state Plato had described in his Republic. The warrior class was kept separate from craftsmen and farmers. These guardians of the state owned no private property, living communally and receiving only what they needed for sustenance. They trained constantly in both physical exercise and music, developing souls that balanced the fierce courage needed for war with the philosophical temperament required for just governance. 10 kings ruled the island, descendants of Poseidon's 10 sons. Every 5 or 6 years, these rulers would gather at the temple of their divine ancestor to consult together and judge any transgressions against their ancient laws. The ceremony they followed was both solemn and magnificent. Using only wooden weapons and nets, they would hunt the sacred bulls that roamed freely within the temple precinct. Once they had captured a bull without spilling its blood, they would sacrifice it over a pillar inscribed with their laws, mixing its blood with wine in a golden bowl. After drinking from this mixture, each king would write his judgment on a golden tablet, dedicating it to the memory of their ancestor. Then, as night fell and the sacred fire died down on the altar, they would don deep blue robes and sit in judgment through the darkness, considering matters of state with the solemnity befitting descendants of a god. For many generations this system flourished. The Atlanteans were content with their prosperity and maintained their reverence for the divine laws that governed them. Their island was rich beyond imagining. The mountains provided timber for their vast construction projects, and pasture lands for their livestock. The plains yielded 2 harvests each year, one watered by winter rains and another by irrigation from mountain streams. The surrounding waters teemed with fish, and the island's mines produced not only gold and silver but also that mysterious metal orichalcum, found nowhere else on Earth. Their navy was the finest the world had ever seen. 12,000 ships could be called up at a moment's notice, each carrying a crew trained from childhood in seamanship and warfare. Their dockyards rang day and night with the sound of hammers shaping hulls, and the voices of craftsmen fitting out vessels for trade or war. Merchant ships bearing the symbol of Atlantis were welcomed in ports throughout the Mediterranean, bringing exotic goods and returning with the tribute that flowed to the island from grateful trading partners. But as you continue reading, you sense the darkness gathering in Plato's narrative. The philosopher is too skilled a storyteller to let paradise continue unchanged. Something in the tone shifts, becomes more ominous. The descendants of Poseidon, he writes, began to change. The divine portion of their nature grew weaker as it was diluted by mortal blood over many generations. Human nature began to dominate their souls. Where once they had been content with abundance, they became greedy for more. Where once they had been just in their dealings with other nations, they began to see conquest as their right. The kings who had once gathered in solemn ceremony to judge transgressors now plotted to extend their dominion over lands that had never sworn allegiance to them. The careful balance between the warrior spirit and philosophical wisdom that had made them great began to tip toward pure aggression. The change manifested itself in ways both subtle and profound. The simple robes and modest lifestyle of the guardian class gave way to ostentation. Gold and silver ornaments appeared where once there had been only functional bronze. The communal meals that had fostered unity were replaced by private banquets, where kings competed to display their wealth. Most significantly, the regular ceremonies of renewal and rededication to their ancient laws became perfunctory. observed more in form than in spirit. You pause in your reading, struck by how familiar this pattern seems. Every civilization you've studied seems to follow a similar arc virtue leading to prosperity. Prosperity to luxury. Luxury to corruption. Corruption to decline. Plato's describing something that feels universal, even inevitable. The very success of Atlantis contains the seeds of its destruction. The final act begins when the corrupted Atlanteans turn their vast military might against the free peoples of the Mediterranean and beyond. No longer content with willing trade partners, they seek to reduce entire nations to slavery. Egypt feels their pressure. The cities of Italy find their independence threatened. Even the scattered islands of the Aegean must choose between submission and destruction. But one small city-state refuses to yield. Athens, according to Plato's account, stands alone against the Atlantean Empire. The contrast could not be more stark. On one side, a vast island nation with unlimited resources, 12,000 ships, and armies that had never known defeat. On the other, a single city outnumbered beyond any reasonable hope of victory. Yet this David among nations possesses something that Atlantis has lost. The Athenians still live according to the principles their ancestors received from the gods. Their warriors train not for conquest, but for the protection of justice. Their leaders govern not for personal gain, but for the common good. In them, the divine spark still burns bright, undiluted by generations of moral compromise. The war that follows tests both civilizations to their limits. Plato provides few details of the battles themselves, focusing instead on their meaning. This is not merely a conflict between nations, but a struggle between two different visions of human society. Atlantis represents power without restraint, prosperity without purpose, strength divorced from wisdom. Athens embodies the opposite: justice upheld even at the cost of survival, duty placed above comfort, the divine law honoured even in the face of overwhelming force. Against all odds, the Athenians prevail. Their smaller armies, motivated by a cause higher than mere conquest, outfight forces that had seemed invincible. One by one, the subject peoples of the Atlantean Empire throw off their chains, inspired by the example of this tiny city that dared to stand for justice. The great navy that had been the terror of the seas finds itself scattered and demoralized, its crews no longer certain what they are fighting for. But victory comes at a terrible price for both sides. In a single day and night of earthquakes and floods, the island of Atlantis disappears beneath the waves. The gods, it seems, have rendered their judgment on a people who possessed everything but forgot the source of their blessings. The very earth rejects them, opening to swallow their palaces and temples, their harbours and gardens, their accumulated treasures and their corrupted souls. Nor does Athens escape unscathed. The same catastrophe that destroys Atlantis also swallows the flower of Athenian youth, the warriors who had fought so bravely to preserve justice in the world. The earth opens beneath their feet as well, erasing nearly all trace of that golden age when virtue and power walked hand in hand. You set down the scroll and lean back in your chair, feeling the weight of what you've just read. The oil in your lamp has burned low, and shadows dance more wildly across the walls. Outside, Athens sleeps on Fernda unaware that in this small room, someone has just encountered one of the most powerful stories ever told about the rise and fall of civilizations, but something doesn't quite fit. As your mind replays the details of Plato's account, you begin to notice things that nag at your consciousness like splinters. The chain of transmission is so elaborate, so carefully constructed, that it almost seems designed to prevent verification. Solon, the supposed original source, left no writings about Atlantis despite allegedly planning to compose a great poem about it. The Egyptian priests, those keepers of ancient wisdom, have somehow preserved a detailed account of events 9,000 years old while leaving no other trace of such record-keeping abilities. More troubling still is the realization of how perfectly Atlantis serves as a mirror image of everything Plato had advocated in his other writings. The social structure of the island, with its separation of classes and communal warrior elite, matches exactly the system he proposed in the Republic. The moral decline he describes follows precisely the pattern he had outlined in his discussions of how ideal states become corrupted. Even the final destruction comes at just the right moment to prevent any possibility of finding physical evidence. You find yourself wondering if perhaps you've been reading this story wrong. Maybe the question isn't whether Atlantis existed, but why Plato needed to create it. What was happening in his Athens that required such a powerful cautionary tale? The Athens of Plato's youth had been very different from the Athens of his maturity. He had grown up during the final stages of the Great War with Sparta, watching his city transform from the idealistic democracy that had produced Pericles and Sophocles into something harder, more cynical, more willing to use power for its own sake. He had witnessed the trial and execution of Socrates, his beloved teacher, condemned by a democracy that had lost patience with questions it found uncomfortable. The Athens Plato knew was one that had tasted great power during its imperial period and found the experience intoxicating. Like his fictional Atlantis, it had begun with high ideals, the defense of Greek freedom against Persian tyranny. Like Atlantis, it had grown wealthy and powerful, creating an empire that stretched across the Aegean. And like Atlantis, it had gradually lost sight of the principles that had originally justified its dominance. In this light, Atlantis begins to look less like ancient history and more like contemporary commentary. Plato is holding up a mirror to his own civilization, showing his fellow Athenians what they are in danger of becoming. The great sea empire that falls due to its own hubris is not a warning about some distant past, but about a possible future. The small virtuous Athens that defeats it is not a memory but an aspiration. This interpretation gains strength when you consider how Plato tells his story. He doesn't present it as myth or allegory, but as historical fact, complete with specific dates and geographical locations. Yet he places it so far in the past and in such an inaccessible location that no one can verify his claims. It's as if he wants his readers to be caught between belief and skepticism, forced to grapple with the truth of the story on a level deeper than mere historical accuracy. The literary device is masterful. By creating a past golden age of Athens, Plato gives his contemporaries a vision of what their city could be at its best. By showing the destruction of a corrupt empire, he warns them of what it might become at its worst. The story works whether you believe in its literal truth or not. Indeed, it might work better if you don't, because then you're forced to confront its meaning rather than getting distracted by archaeological questions. But if this is Plato's intention, it reveals something profound about the nature of truth itself. The philosopher who had spent his career arguing that the physical world was merely a shadow of eternal forms has created a story that is itself, shadow of political and moral truths. Atlantis doesn't need to have existed as a physical place because it exists as an idea, and ideas, in Plato's philosophy, are more real than material objects. This realization transforms your understanding of what you've been reading. You're not holding an ancient history text, but something closer to a philosophical novel, a work of imagination designed to explore the deepest questions about human nature and society. The detailed descriptions of Atlantis' rings and harbours are not attempts at archaeological accuracy, but literary techniques designed to make an abstract argument feel concrete and immediate. Yet even as you reach this conclusion, you find yourself strangely reluctant to let go of the more literal interpretation. There's something powerful about the idea that such a civilization actually existed, that human beings once achieved such heights of organisation and artistry, even if they ultimately fell. The loss feels more poignant if it was real, the warning more urgent if it's based on actual historical experience rather than philosophical speculation. This tension between the desire for Atlantis to be real and the evidence that it's fictional has played out over and over again throughout history. You can trace a direct line from Plato's original story through centuries of speculation and searching, each generation finding in Atlantis what they needed to find. Medieval scholars, living in a world where classical learning was being rediscovered, saw in Atlantis proof that the ancients possessed wisdom that had been lost. Renaissance utopian writers like Thomas More and Francis Bacon used the idea of a perfect society destroyed by its own flaws as a starting point for imagining better forms of government. Enlightenment thinkers found in the story confirmation of their theories about the progress and decline of civilizations. But it was in the 19th century that Atlantis truly came alive in the popular imagination. Ignatius Donnelly's Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, published in 882, transformed Plato's philosophical allegory into a scientific hypothesis. Donnelly argued that Atlantis was not merely one civilization among many, but the parent civilization of the entire world, the source from which all human knowledge and culture had originally flowed. According to Donnelly's theory, survivors of Atlantis' destruction had scattered across the globe, carrying fragments of their advanced knowledge to every continent. This explained why ancient civilizations in places as far apart as Egypt and Peru showed similarities in their architecture, mythology, and social organisation. It also explained why flood myths appeared in cultures that had no apparent contact with each other. All were dim memories of the great catastrophe that had destroyed the mother civilization. The theory was seductive because it seemed to solve so many puzzles at once. Why did the ancient Egyptians and Mayans both build pyramids Atlantean influence? Why did cultures around the world develop similar religious and philosophical ideas? They were all drawing from the same Atlantean source. Why did human civilization seem to make sudden leaps forward at certain points in history? Atlantean refugees were sharing their knowledge with primitive peoples. But Donnelly's Atlantis was very different from Plato's. Where the philosopher had created a cautionary tale about moral decline, Donnelly imagined a golden age of wisdom and prosperity. Where Plato had emphasized the corruption that led to destruction, Donnelly focused on the advanced technology and peaceful governance that had supposedly existed before the catastrophe. In transforming Atlantis from a negative example into a positive one, he fundamentally changed its meaning. This new version of the Atlantis story resonated powerfully with the concerns of Donnelly's era. The late 19th century was a time of rapid technological and social change, when the pace of progress could be both exhilarating and unsettling. The idea that human civilization had once reached even greater heights, only to be set back by natural catastrophe, offered both comfort and hope. It suggested that current achievements were not the pinnacle of human potential, but a recovery from past glory. The scientific revolution of the modern era only seemed to support such ideas. If human beings in the 20th century could build flying machines and electronic computers, why shouldn't their ancestors have achieved similar marvels? If current civilizations could be threatened by nuclear weapons and environmental destruction, why shouldn't past civilizations have faced similar catastrophes? This line of thinking opened the door to increasingly elaborate theories about Atlantis' location and technology. No longer content with Plato's relatively simple description of an advanced Bronze Age civilization, modern Atlantis hunters began imagining crystal power sources, flying vehicles, and energy weapons that could explain both the heights the Atlanteans had reached and the completeness of their destruction. Each proposed location for Atlantis reflected the particular concerns and blind spots of its era. When the Mediterranean was the centre of the known world, Atlantis was placed in the Atlantic Ocean just beyond the familiar waters. When European colonialism opened up new continents, Atlantis was relocated to the Americas, the lost civilization that supposedly explained the achievements of the Maya and Aztecs. When aviation shrank distances and made remote locations accessible, Atlantis moved to Antarctica, safely buried under miles of ice where it could never be definitively disproven. The search for physical evidence of Atlantis has been remarkably persistent despite the complete lack of success. The island of Santorini in the Aegean Sea has been a particular favourite among those who want to ground Plato's story in historical fact. The island's volcanic explosion around 1600 BCE and its partial submersion beneath the sea seem to offer a perfect parallel to Plato's account of Atlantis' destruction. Yet the parallels dissolve under closer examination. The timing is wrong by thousands of years. The location contradicts Plato's explicit placement of Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Most importantly, the Minoan civilization that flourished on Santorini before the explosion bears little resemblance to the militaristic empire Plato described. The Minoans were traders and artists, not conquerors, and their society shows none of the rigid class structure that Plato attributed to Atlantis. More recently, attention has focused on the Rishat structure in the Sahara Desert, a circular geological formation that some claim matches Plato's description of Atlantis' concentric rings. The structure is certainly impressive, stretching nearly 30 miles across, and its regular circular pattern does create an eerie resemblance to architectural design. But geology provides a far simpler explanation than ancient civilization. The Risha structure is a natural dome that has been eroded over millions of years. Its circular ridges the result of differential weathering of different rock layers. The persistence of such theories in the face of contrary evidence reveals something important about the human need for Atlantis to be real. Each generation seems to require its own version of the lost golden age, perfectly adapted to contemporary anxieties and aspirations. For Donnelly's generation, worried about the pace of industrial change, Atlantis offered proof that progress and tradition could coexist. For the space age, fearful of nuclear destruction, Atlantis became a warning about the dangers of advanced technology. For the environmental movement, concerned about climate change and resource depletion, Atlantis represents a civilization that fell due to its own hubris in challenging the natural world. But perhaps the most revealing thing about modern Atlantis theories is how completely they've inverted Plato's original meaning, where he created a story about the corrupting effects of power and wealth. Popular culture has transformed Atlantis into a symbol of lost innocence and wisdom, where he warned against the dangers of abandoning moral principles in pursuit of expansion and dominance. Modern versions of the story mourn the loss of a peaceful, technologically advanced civilization destroyed by natural forces beyond human control. This transformation reflects a broader change in how we understand history and human nature. Plato lived in a world where moral decline was seen as a real and constant danger, where virtue required constant vigilance and discipline. Modern culture, influenced by ideas of progress and technological solutions, tends to see human problems as ultimately solvable through better knowledge and more advanced tools. In this context, Atlantis becomes not a warning about the consequences of moral failure, but a promise that human wisdom and technology can overcome any challenge, if only we can rediscover the secrets that have been lost. The irony is profound. In trying to make Atlantis real, we've made it less true. Plato's fictional Atlantis carried a genuine insight about the cyclical nature of civilizations and the universal human tendency toward corruption and decline. Our attempts to locate the lost city on actual maps and ground its destruction in natural catastrophes have transformed this insight into a simple adventure story, complete with the comforting implication that we could avoid Atlantis' fate, if only we were clever enough to find its ruins and learn its secrets. Yet the story refuses to die. No matter how many times archaeologists fail to find evidence, or geologists explain away circular formations in the ocean floor. If anything, the digital age has given new life to Atlantis theories, allowing enthusiasts to share elaborate reconstructions and detailed arguments with global audiences. Satellite imagery provides new hunting grounds for amateur archaeologists, while documentary television celebrates each new theory with equal enthusiasm. Regardless of its scientific merit, the enduring appeal of these searches reveals something profound about the human relationship with the past. We seem to need our ancestors to have been both more and less than we are more wise and technologically advanced, but less able to preserve their achievements in the face of catastrophe. This paradox allows us to feel both humbled before their supposed wisdom and confident in our ability to do better. But what if we've been asking the wrong question all along instead of trying to determine whether Atlantis existed? Perhaps we should ask why we need it to exist. What is it about Plato's story that continues to capture imaginations more than 2 millennia after it was written? Part of the answer lies in the story structure, which perfectly captures the trajectory of human hope and disappointment. Atlantis begins in paradise, a civilization blessed by the gods with everything it could need for prosperity and happiness. It achieves greatness through the proper balance of virtue and power, wisdom and strength. But then comes the inevitable corruption, the gradual abandonment of the principles that made greatness possible. Finally, destruction arrives not as arbitrary punishment, but as the natural consequence of moral failure. This pattern feels true not just for civilizations, but for individual human lives. We all begin with high hopes and noble intentions. We all experience periods when everything seems to be working, when our efforts are rewarded and our relationships flourish. And we all face the constant temptation to let success go to our heads, to assume that our achievements are permanent, and that the rules that govern others don't apply to us. Atlantis serves as a mirror in which we can see both our potential and our limitations. It reminds us that no civilization, no matter how advanced, is immune to the fundamental human weaknesses that lead to decline. But it also suggests that these weaknesses are not inevitable, that decline can be avoided if we remain conscious of our moral obligations and resist the corrupting effects of power and prosperity. The story also speaks to our deep ambivalence about progress itself. We live in an age of unprecedented technological capability, able to communicate instantly across continents, to cure diseases that would have been death sentences for our ancestors, to understand the fundamental structure of matter and energy. Yet this same power threatens us with environmental destruction, nuclear war, and social fragmentation. Like the Atlanteans in Plato's story, we find ourselves wondering whether our capabilities have outrun our wisdom. In this context, Atlantis becomes a way of thinking about what went wrong and what might be done differently. If such a civilization really existed and really fell, then perhaps we can learn from their mistakes. If the story is purely fictional, it still provides a framework for analysing our own situation and the choices we face as individuals and societies. The lamp beside you flickers and dims, its oil nearly exhausted. The scroll lies open on the table, Plato's words as vivid now as when they were first written. Outside, the city sleeps on, unaware that it has played host to one of humanity's most enduring conversations about the nature of civilization and the human condition. You realise that your initial question has been answered, though not in the way you expected. You came looking for information about a lost city and found instead a meditation on the cyclical nature of human achievement and failure. You sought historical facts and discovered philosophical truths. Most importantly, you learned that some stories are too important to be merely true. The search for Atlantis will continue, driven by the same needs that have sustained it for over 2,000 years. Each generation will rediscover Plato's story and find in it a reflection of their own hopes and fears. Some will insist on treating it as literal history, mounting expeditions to ocean floors and desert wastes. Others will recognise it as allegory but still feel its emotional power, its ability to make abstract principles feel concrete and urgent. Both approaches miss something essential, but both also capture something real. The literalists are wrong about the facts, but right about the importance of grounding philosophical insights in vivid, memorable imagery. The allegorists are right about the story's fictional nature, but sometimes lose sight of its emotional impact, its ability to make us feel the tragedy of lost possibilities and the urgency of moral choice. Perhaps the deepest truth about Atlantis is that it exists in the same realm as all the most important human stories not in the physical world, that we can measure and map, but in the realm of meaning and significance that we create through our need to understand ourselves and our place in the cosmos. It is real in the way that all great literature is real, by capturing truths about human experience that are more important than historical accuracy. The flame in your lamp gutters and dies, leaving you in darkness. But the story continues to live in your mind, as it has lived in countless minds before yours and will live in countless minds to come, somewhere in that dark Atlantic, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, in a realm that is neither fully real nor entirely imaginary. The island of Atlantis continues its eternal cycle of rise and fall, creation and destruction, hubris and nemesis. You close the scroll and prepare for sleep, carrying with you the memory of a civilization that never was but somehow feels more real than the stone and marble city that surrounds you. In your dreams, you might walk the circular harbours of Poseidon's Island, witness the solemn ceremonies of the 10 kings, or watch the great waves rise to claim a paradise that forgot the source of its blessings. And in the morning, you will wake to find that the questions raised by Plato's story have not been answered but deepened. What does it mean to build a just society? How do we preserve virtue in the face of prosperity? Is human nature fundamentally flawed? Or do our failures stem from choices that could be made differently? These are the questions that Atlantis was designed to raise, and they remain as urgent today as they were when Plato first put stylus to papyrus in the Athens of the 4th century BCE. The city beneath the waves may never have existed, but the human struggles it represents are as real as the sunrise that will soon illuminate another day in the long history of civilizations rising and falling, learning and forgetting, reaching for greatness and grappling with the consequences of their own success. Sleep well, and let the whispers of that lost civilization remind you that the most important truths are not always the ones that can be proven, but the ones that help us understand who we are and who we might become